What are the hidden religious traits in our thinking?
Well, the first thing one should consider is that there's a relation, a tight relation between religion, religious institution, religious belief, and a given culture. Yeah. So I don't know if the religion is the cause of the culture or if the culture is the cause of the religion, but it's a bit like the chicken and the egg. It's not so much one is the cause of the other one, but that they're rather coherent. And on this, there's a very simple example to take, is the religious wars in the in the 17th century in particular, in Western Europe between Protestant and Catholic, where basically the Protestant rebelled against the authority of the Pope, but authority in general, the authority of the kings, and the whole hierarchical system. So today, when you look at the map of Europe, you see a Southern Europe that is much more Catholic oriented, even though today religion has lost some of its aura and power, but still there is a sort of a matrix of thinking where Southern Europe, France, Italy, Spain are rather Catholic, and the Northern Europe is more Protestant. But when you look at it, the political conception and the culture is very different in Northern Europe and Southern Europe. For example, the Northerners are much more egalitarian. Southern Europe is much more into hierarchy and the idea that there is people who are above the others and accepting the idea of authority. So when there was a Protestant reform and the religious wars, this cultural dimension already existed. The idea of equality, for example, is much stronger in the north than in the south. So the idea is that the Protestantism installed itself much quicker, much better, much easier in the north of Europe than in the south of Europe. Yeah, and another aspect is the insistence on enterprise, on the work, on working, on producing, yeah? Something that Max Weber explained very nicely when he showed the connection between Protestant ideology, the ethics, and industrial development, yeah? So the northern culture is much more oriented toward production, toward being efficient, when the South is much more into relation, a certain pleasure about life, enjoying pleasures. And don't forget that Protestant culture was highly critical of pleasures. Yeah. So first of all, just to show that there's a connection between culture in general and religion and religious belief. Yeah. So now, when it's interesting that when you speak to people from different countries, and you understand the main religion of this country or the traditional religion, you can easily connect to the way that people think. Yeah. Now to deal with the Orthodox, to deal with the Slavic world or the Orthodox culture in general, there's one striking aspect compared to the West is the refusal of reason. The Eastern Church, one of the reasons of the split between the East and the West was very much on the idea of reason, on the relationship to philosophy, for example. Augustine, which is a pillar of Western Christianity, was a philosopher. He's a famous philosopher. He even said that if there was no God, Plato should be the God, and he was very concerned with reason. So he addresses all theological issue from the standpoint of reason. And this reason is what you see in the development of Western European culture and, for example, how it fostered scientific development. When the Orthodox Church is more into mysticism, it's more a religion of the heart. And reason is viewed as something not so holy, not so welcome. And we can think back at the Old Testament and how precisely the reason why Adam and Eve were expelled from the earthly paradise is because they wanted to eat the tree of knowledge, the fruits of the tree of knowledge. And by doing that, they were competing with God. They just didn't want to be the faithful children of God, but they wanted to be autonomous, independent. And in a way, that's what the snake did. And the snake, of course, supposed to be bad. Teach them that they could as well have some autonomy and compete with God. And this is done through the idea of knowledge. And knowledge is, we should put knowledge and reason together. Autonomous capacity of thinking of human beings is very much something that is not welcome by the Orthodox tradition. And that's what we see in most countries under Orthodox influence, that reason is not a primary issue. Reason is not viewed as something particularly at the center. What is more is this connected to the religion of the heart, subjectivity. It's my belief, my opinions, my choice, my freedom, my friends. Yeah, actually, there's an interesting issue here as well on the question of freedom, and one dealt with it very well is Shestov, the Russian philosopher, although Berdyaev as well dealt with it, that precisely the Western God is not free because he's prisoner of reason. He's prisoner of the good. So God does things because they're good, when in the Orthodox tradition, God is totally free, and things are good because he wants them, because he decides them. So freedom comes first, and you see this very much in the Slavic culture, that freedom is primary. Yeah, why should I be determined by some kind of abstract, formal reason? For example, argument. See, in particular in the Protestant culture, argumentation is very important. In the way that Protestantism developed, it was not so much the priest that would, unlike in Catholic religion, that would explain the scriptures. It would be the faithful who would gather together, and they would study the scriptures together, and they would give arguments, and they would listen to the arguments, and they would go for the more rational or reasonable arguments, and this is the one that we would go with. Yeah. But the argumentation, I noticed in Russia, for example, is not viewed as something bearing any truth or any grounding. It's more something people use as a way to compete, as the way to show they're smart, as an expression of subjectivity. But arguments don't have a real substantial meaning. Yeah. So the idea that freedom, subjectivity is at the heart of the culture. That's why power is so important. Yeah. One thing in the West that started with Augustine is to say that power should always be subjected to reason. Augustine has this nice sentence that if power is not subjected to reason, it's just like a bunch of hoodlums. Yeah. When in the east of Europe, the idea of who has power is right. You don't question the authority. The authority is right because it's the authority. And what goes for the king or for the patriarch goes as well for anyone. I'm free. I do what I want, and by definition, I'm right, since it is my opinion, my choice, my power. Yeah. And the point is to get as much power as possible. Yeah. So these are some of the elements that we can spot of the coherency between culture and religion. But like I said, the issue to know which one comes first, the culture or the religion, I think it doesn't make much sense. The point is more to see that the religion and the culture fit together. So as a result, actually, when you speak to people who are claim to be not religious or that reject the religion, it doesn't matter. They still have the matrix. I see this in Italy a lot, where intellectual people tend to be very much anti-pope, anti-church. But when I speak to them, I see many of similar concepts. For example, the idea of perfection, which as well you see in the Orthodox culture, the fear of mistake, yeah, and the idea that fundamentally we are weak, and because we are sinners, yeah. So you see this, that, and people are surprised because even when you, or they have a very moral perspective. So even when they say that they don't like the church or religion, you see that the matrix is quite similar. You find some similar thing. You have it in the Slavic culture with the idea of the Old Testament. It's actually much more connected to the Old Testament than the New Testament. The Catholics are more into the love, Jesus as love. But the Slavic culture is very much with the Old Testament, where we're all fundamentally sinners, we're imperfect, we're a bit doomed in a way, and we have to suffer. Suffering is part of being saved, and if you suffer enough, then maybe you go to paradise, which is why suffering is so normal. In Russia, for example, to suffer is not something extraordinary. You don't even think about it, if it's right, wrong, if it's good or bad. Suffering is life, and life is suffering. Life is a valley of tears, yeah? So the idea of joy is very, very, very strange, yeah? Actually, when I think about Protestant and Catholic, there is on this issue, there's a famous sentence by Germans to say, to be happy like God in France, because France, the German are serious, they're hard worker, they're very Protestant, even though some part of it is Catholic. When France is viewed as a place for good food, for pleasure, for enjoying yourself, which is viewed as not so serious, not so reliable, because people think more it's pleasure. And actually, one of the criticisms of the Protestant against the Catholic was that you could get off. You could buy some forgiveness for your sins just by going to the church and giving a bit of money or confessing of something like this. When the Protestants have this in common with the Orthodox, no, you cannot get rid of your sins so easily. We're fundamentally sinner, and you have to suffer. In fact, that's the Protestants as well are not exactly joyful people, and they're very much into obligations and not so much the joy of life. That's why food is much better in Southern Europe than in Northern Europe, because it's considered that enjoying life and the pleasure of the senses is fine. It's not against religion, and you can go after, if you have too much pleasure, you can go to church and ask for forgiveness of God for the priest. And when in the North, no, that would be too easy. Yeah. So you can tell tragic countries and serious countries by the fact their food maybe is not so good. Yeah, because the joy of life is not at the center of their existence. So these are the elements that I can bring up about the connection between culture and religion. Yeah, and I only spoke about Christianity because there's a lot to be said about Christianity and the diverse form of Christianity. But you could as well add this with the Buddhist thinking, for example, was to see how Buddhism, the essence of Buddhism, is to get out of suffering and to discover peace for the vacuity. It is very striking when you meet Chinese or Indian people, has this idea of being peaceful is a very important concept in their culture. It doesn't mean necessarily they're peaceful, but at least that is something that is considered some ideal, something you should try to reach.